Good morning, good evening, good day, good night. This is Dr. Theresa J, Canada, and the host of the Silk Stocking Sisters podcast, and welcome to a new episode. In this episode, I will continue this discussion about the history of the New York State / New York City public school desegregation experience, or basically what was happening with desegregation in New York City. As you all know, I was part of a desegregation process, and it's all documented in my book. And I wanted to talk specifically to share this information for those who are not able to read the book or don't know this information about the desegregation process in the state of New York, in New York City in particular. So without further ado, I'm going to continue the discussion that I started in part one of the episode, where I talked about the beginning, starting from the state appointment, basically the state bill that outlawed colored schools, and up to where we are now discussing about what prompted the effort to desegregate or integrate, in some cases, the public schools in New York City. And that all came from the Brown decision from the 1954 Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education. So in June 1955, as we talked about what the New York City was doing, there was the Commission on Integration. It was appointed. They appointed subcommittees to investigate or to study and recommend ways in which to solve or find solutions to in terms of integrating the New York City public schools, and in turn prevent more racially segregated schools. That was some of the goals that was set aside for this Commission on Integration, and they appointed subcommittees to deal with this. So these subcommittees were in the following areas. These are the areas that they had subcommittees that were appointed: zoning, educational standards and placement, teachers' assignment and personnel, community relations and information, and physical plant and maintenance. Those are the subcommittees that were designated, or were basically, that was recommended to help solve this issue with integration and to integrate the New York City public schools. So these subcommittees were basically, they met over an 18-month period to try to come up with some solutions to the situation in New York City public schools. The key issue in the implementation report was the rezoning of school districts. That was the key issue for implementation. So, as all the committees I just mentioned to you that existed, the key subcommittee, of course, was a zoning committee. So I'm going to address the recommendations of the zoning committee's report and what it led to. So first of all, let's define what school zoning is, for those of you who don't know. School zoning is a term used to describe how school districts partition schools into sections to manage enrollments. That's really the overall theme. And zoning lines are constantly redrawn as new housing and populations change. Those are the two key components that relate to school zoning, okay? Setting out specific school districts in terms of managing enrollments, and number two, zoning lines are constantly changing based upon the housing situation and the population change that happens in each school district. That should be some basic information that you should have. So the recommendations of the zoning subcommittee asked that the Board of Education consider drawing new zoning lines to encourage integrated versus segregated schools. That was a recommendation that they made. That was from this specific subcommittee. Now, implementation of this recommendation entailed transporting or busing students. This option had already been used or applied in the New York City public schools prior to this time, and that was to address the overcrowded schools issues that were taking place in schools as a whole. So this is nothing new for the New York City Board of Education, but they just used it for overcrowding schools, and they would bus children to other schools so they could equalize the population of students in the schools. So there was overcrowded issues, because of depending upon how many people live in that zoning area, they had to bus students to other schools so they could be able to not have such an overcrowding classrooms. So the zoning subcommittee asked that rezoning, along with transporting of the students, be used in integration to assist with school utilization. And that's a very key point that I want to talk about. School utilization, meaning how many students do you have and how many, do you need to be able to be effective in terms of providing the education that's needed for the students in your school. And I addressed the issue of school utilization as one of the reasons why I probably attended PS6, because it wasn't that so much an effort to integrate PS6 per se, but it was also mainly an issue with school utilization, meaning PS6 was losing students in their zoning, in their zone catchment area. And because at that point, more and more families were moving out of New York City, out of that particular neighborhood, and moving to the suburbs. And so or either their children were going to attend private schools at that point as well. So in order for PS6 to function in a way that they'd been used to functioning, they needed more students to fill the seats in the classrooms. But the thing about PS6, they wanted to choose the students who were going to come, not just anybody getting the bus and come. They wanted to be selective in terms of the students who were coming. So it was a selective process as part of their utilization efforts for PS6. So the subcommittee also supported what was termed permissive zoning. Now, what is permissive zoning? That's another way in which efforts can be taken to try to deal with the utilization problem and also deal with the segregated school problems. This was a very specific way that parents could, in fact, request a transfer from a non-integrated school in their neighborhood to a school that was considered integrated in another neighborhood. Now, with that, quote, choice, there were some things that were tied to that option. The only way this option would be accepted is if the schools permitted the transfer. That was key. The schools, both the school the parent's child was leaving from and the school that was going to receive the student, they both have to agree on accepting or making a decision about whether that student can leave the school or whether the student can attend the school they want to go to deal with the efforts of integrating schools. So if the school that the child left, this is key, this is what we're talking about, what's important about funds. If the school that the child left might lose funds, they would not support the transfer. That's number one. Also, if the school that received the child felt they had enough students from a specific race, they might not accept the transfer as well. So here you have a situation that a school, funding was important. So some schools, they didn't want to lose all these students, they would lose funding for their schools. And then at the same time, the school that was most likely less segregated, was in the predominantly white neighborhoods, they said, oh, we have enough of this population. We don't need any more. Now, I didn't see anywhere in my research where it said it was a specific percentage or number. I have never seen any of that in my research. So that's a very interesting point to take into consideration. So what does that say about who had the most priority in terms of deciding who was going to come and who was not to come? But if dealt around two issues, finances and race. Okay? Very important point, finances and race. And let's think about how that may affect situations today. And that's going to probably be in another podcast at some of the point. So let's go back. An implementation committee was formed to carry out the recommendations. So here's another committee. So you've got the committee that's set up to look at recommendations, and then you have to have another committee to consider implementation of the recommendations. So implementation committee was formed to carry out the recommendations of the Commission on Integration. Now, the majority of the recommendations dealt with this, the improvement of the educational experience for so-called underprivileged children. Why that's the case, we have no idea. But that was really what the majority of the recommendations were made. They dealt with improving the educational conditions of so-called underprivileged children. And in many cases, we all know what that meant. For those of us who know, right? So for those who don't know, read. Okay. All right. Here are some of the recommendations. Number one, rezoning to increase the amount of mixing and silently segregated schools. That's number one. The second recommendation was building a new school in an area of growth and to prevent the future growth of schools and residential segregation. And finally, the third recommendation was the reassignment of teachers. And let me go through each of those recommendations and how I see this in terms of making a difference or maybe not making a difference. So rezoning to increase the amount of mixing in solidly segregated schools. That seemed like it was only possible basically when it was a predominantly white school. To this day, I do not recall the school that I left in Harlem, New York City. They did not receive any white students. All right. They had an issue with overcrowdedness. So they need to send some of their students out. And so I was sent out, but I was sent out to PS6. I wasn't put on a yellow school bus or anything. But the fact is, as I mentioned before, and I said before, we were tested. That those of us that I remember coming to PS6 with me, we were tested. We weren't just, okay, get on a bus and you go, you get to a classroom. No, they wanted to make sure that students who were coming to PS6 were going to be able to fit in or basically not upset the academic status of the school to that at that point in the history of the school, and pretty much as it is today, because the school's still in existence. So, in essence, that particular recommendation was helpful, but it did not do the reverse for basically the segregated, predominantly Black and Puerto Rican schools that existed in the city at the time. And I know people who stayed at my elementary school, and it didn't occur the year after I left, the year after, or either anytime soon. It's just that it was always students were sent who may have been sent out. And basically, the utilization was an issue for PS6. They needed to have students in their classrooms. And so we were able to fulfill that goal for PS6. But like I said before, it was a selective process as opposed to just sending people to a school to fill some seats. All right. Now, the second one was, building new schools. Yes, they built some new schools, but that was because there were some highly overcrowded schools in the areas that had mostly Black and Puerto Rican students who were attending because of what was happening, the migration to the north and from Puerto Rico. It was very, very significant that the numbers of Black and Puerto Rican classrooms were filled to the rim. So that, building of schools were pretty much built in the neighborhoods where they were needed. And that really took place in the neighborhoods that had an overpopulation, overcrowded classrooms, overcrowded schools. Now, the third recommendation was reassignment of teachers. That's very interesting. In terms of teacher reassignment, the goal was to increase the number of teachers in an area where needed, and also as well as to increase the quality of teachers in areas where needed. So quality and numbers were the key piece. But as I mentioned before, in my book, and in the book, there were no Black teachers in the school that I attended. None. All right, none. So most often, teachers and other school staff, including administration, were assigned to schools based on the racial composition of the neighborhoods. While there were white teachers in Black and Latino neighborhood schools, rarely, if any, Black teachers were assigned to predominantly white neighborhoods. Now, what does that say? That says that it was okay. You were going to be okay. The Black teachers, like I said, I didn't have a Black teacher again after my 4th grade class. I didn't have any. My 3rd grade teacher was a Black teacher, and that was the last Black teacher I had in elementary school, the last one. It was the first, I think, and also the last. So that is significant. So even though they were able to bus students to different or even transport them to different schools to efforts integration, they did not do that with teachers and or administrators. Most administrators and teachers stayed in predominantly Black and Puerto Rican neighborhoods, period, or in schools that existed within those neighborhoods. But then other teachers were able to come to the Black and Puerto Rican schools who are not Black or Puerto Rican teachers. Okay. So that says a lot about the so-called reassignment of teachers. And I think that if they were conscientious and concerned about the images and the role models that students have, it would have, it would behoove them to have considered having some Black and brown teachers sent to the schools where it was predominantly white environment per se. That's just my take. Okay, because I understand how important role models can be and images can be for young children specifically. Now, although the recommendations were completed and received by the superintendents by 1958, implementation did not proceed until after protests from various civic organizations and community groups. So in essence, yes, you have these recommendations, you have this implementation recommendation, but nothing else was moving in 1958, still wasn't moving. So the functions of the implementation committee were transferred to a newly created New York City Board of Education Special Committee on Integration. And that was after the 1958 period of time. Now, a special committee on integration, which was in existence, and it was in existence up until 1990, as a matter of fact, that special committee on integration still exists up until 1990. So it still was part of the New York City Board of Education profile, in a sense, to try to keep implementation of integrating schools. It's just that, why did it take so long? Okay. Because there was probably a lot of pressure not to do that for certain situations. Now, although my experience in 4th grade was taking the New York City public buses, I didn't take a yellow school bus to the school where I was sent to. But the year after I arrived at that school, which was by the 5th grade, there were buses that were coming, yellow school buses with children who would get on buses and, get off the buses and come into the school. And those students were not tested like I was tested for music or art. I don't know if they even checked the academic. I think there was an effort to just basically try to integrate the predominantly white schools in that effort. So that's what I think was happening. So to learn more about the implementation and history of the desegregation of the New York City schools, to consider purchasing my book, Desegregation of New York City Schools, A Story of the Silk Stocking Sisters. It's available on Amazon. It's a link on my website. You can click that and go directly to the site. Or if you want a personalized autographed copy, send me an email and contact me and we'll make some arrangements. Or if you just want to read the book and not purchase it, check out the various college and university libraries around the country and around the world. Check worldcat.org, WORLD, worldcat.org, to borrow a copy to read. And the book is available all over the world, in different countries all over the world. And of course, there's some here in the States. And then maybe you can get those in that fact. You can get the book from that situation and then not have to purchase it. But it would be nice to have a copy, right? So anyway, thank you for listening. I've given an overview. Hopefully you learned something from this experience and what I've shared with you today, and that you can take this and provide other information as to what we need to do moving forward, which may be in future podcasts about where do we go from here, because we're still dealing with issues of segregated schools, quote unquote, and it may not be something that we can resolve because the demographics of this country. So that's something I may be discussing in a future podcast. So until the next time, thank you again for attending and checking us out. And I look forward to seeing you again in another future podcast. Thank you and have a great day, wonderful evening, night, wherever you are around the country, around the world. And again, thank you for supporting the Silk Stocking Sisters podcast. Have a good day, everybody.